There is a specific kind of chaos that only happens when a late-night comedian decides to stop being polite about it. Not the chaos of a political crisis, not the chaos of a breaking news alert at midnight. The slower, stickier, far more embarrassing kind, where the jokes land, stay landed, and refuse to leave the room no matter how many statements get released, how many press briefings get scheduled, or how many times someone in an official capacity tries to redirect the conversation towards something more flattering. That is exactly what Jimmy Kimmel built over the course of one of the strangest weeks in recent political memory. And somewhere in the middle of it, Karoline Leavitt found herself standing at a podium trying to answer questions that sounded like they had been generated by a malfunctioning news ticker and a very confused history professor working at the same time. Las Vegas, taxes, and 3 very recognizable costumes. It started in Las Vegas, because of course it did. The city built entirely on the premise that illusions can be sustained long enough to get people to reach into their wallets turned out to be the perfect venue for the rollout of the no tax on tips proposal. A policy that sounded simple, looked strategic, and was designed to photograph well. The round table was carefully assembled. A police officer, a firefighter, a construction worker, respectable working-class faces representing the people the policy was meant to help. The cameras were rolling. The messaging was polished. The narrative was ready. Then Kimmel got hold of it. 3 of the 5 village people, he told the audience. And the audience fell apart. It was 11 words. It took approximately 3 seconds. And it completely reframed the entire visual, taking what was supposed to read as authentic representation of everyday Americans and turning it into something that now looked like a casting call for a themed event that nobody had thought all the way through. That is the specific damage satire does that press releases cannot undo. It does not argue with the policy. It does not engage with the details. It finds the single visual inconsistency that everyone was already half noticing without naming, and it names it loudly. And once it's been named, the original image never quite recovers its intended meaning. And that was just the opening act. The taxes nobody could answer. While the Las Vegas event was still processing, a reporter asked Karoline Leavitt a question that seemed straightforward enough on its surface. Had the president filed his taxes, and would he be releasing them publicly? Leavitt acknowledged it was a good question, said she hadn't asked the president directly about it, promised to follow up. Kimmel took the promise and set it down next to a very specific historical fact, that every president since Jimmy Carter has released their tax returns while in office, with one exception. He did not need to say the name. The audience already knew it. "You will never hear from me again," he told the crowd, referring to the follow-up that everyone in the room understood was not coming. Then, because no moment should go unexaggerated when the material is this cooperative, he added the kicker. Trump's accountant had reportedly described his returns as the strongest and healthiest he had ever seen. The audience laughed the way people laugh when the joke is almost too obvious to be funny, and then find it funnier for exactly that reason. The arch that launched 1,000 questions. Then came the monument. The administration announced plans for a triumphal arch in Washington, D.C. The press secretary described it, apparently with a straight face, as an architectural masterpiece that would inspire generations. Kimmel did not treat this as a serious policy proposal. He treated it as a gift, because the historical context did not help. The most famous triumphal arch on Earth, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, was built to honor soldiers who bled and died for their country. Their names are physically carved into its structure. It is a monument to sacrifice, loss, and national memory. The weight of it is not decorative, it is moral. The American proposal did not carry that same energy, and the location, in proximity to Arlington National Cemetery, meant that whatever the intention was, the optics placed it in direct visual conversation with the most sacred burial ground in the country. Veterans groups raised concerns. Preservationists objected. Critics questioned not just the design, but the impulse behind it. And a federal judge had already stepped in to halt a related construction project, writing in his ruling that national security is not a blank check to proceed with otherwise unlawful activity. Kimmel read the phrase triumphal arch out loud to his audience, with the timing of a man savoring every syllable, and the studio erupted before he got to the punchline. Because sometimes the premise is the punchline. Sometimes you just have to say the thing clearly, and the room does the rest. The Pope's brother is MAGA. But none of the week's material, not the village people, not the taxes, not the arch, hit quite as hard as the Pope's situation. Because at some point during the ongoing public conflict between President Trump and Pope Leo XIV, Trump made a strategic decision to introduce a previously unknown character into the narrative, the Pope's brother. His name, Trump confirmed to reporters, was Louis. Lewis was MAGA all the way, had MAGA all over his house, was a big MAGA person. Trump repeated this information multiple times in multiple settings, as if the siblings' political affiliation somehow changed the theological and moral content of the Pope's statements about war, peace, and nuclear weapons. Kimmel simply let the clips run. He did not need to add much. He read the relevant Truth Social post out loud. Pope Leo is weak on crime, and then stopped 6 words in because, as he explained, he had to take a break just to process the information before he could continue. He stood there for a moment, visibly struggling to contain himself, and the audience laughed hard and long because the image of reading a serious national statement and needing to pause for recovery 6 words in captured something true about the week. The post went on to suggest that Leo would not be in the Vatican if Trump were not in the White House. The church had selected him specifically as a strategy to manage the American president. That Lewis, the MAGA brother, was the clearly superior sibling. Kimmel's observation was simple and devastating, as if that's a compliment. AI Jesus and the optics problem. Then came the images. Trump posted AI-generated content depicting himself in visually messianic contexts. First alongside Jesus, then in configurations that made several people on the internet audibly uncomfortable, in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Kimmel noted, with the careful precision of someone who has done this long enough to know when to understate a thing, that Trump appeared to genuinely believe these images were paintings, that he did not seem to understand they were AI-generated, that he was treating algorithmically produced flattery as artistic tribute. He showed the image. He noted the cheekbones. He observed that someone had been doing some significant image enhancement. The audience reacted the way audiences react when a joke lands in the precise space between funny and genuinely unsettling. And then the caption landed. Jesus, visible in the background of one image, appeared to be quietly, desperately begging him to stop. The studio did not recover from that one for a good 30 seconds. Karoline Leavitt in the eye of the storm. Throughout all of this, the arch, the taxes, the Pope's MAGA brother, the AI portraits of a potentially divine president, Karoline Leavitt was standing at the podium trying to keep control of a narrative that had already escaped the building. The problem was structural and nearly impossible to solve. By the time any official response was prepared and delivered, the clips had already traveled. Kimmel's segments had already been chopped into shareable pieces and reposted across every major platform at speeds that traditional messaging infrastructure simply cannot match. Each clarification arrived after the audience had already moved 2 conversations forward. Each reframing was processed, not through the original context, but through the comedic lens that had already been applied. It was not a failure of messaging skill. It was a timing problem with no clean solution. Because once satire reaches critical mass, once the jokes are being shared faster than the press briefings are being scheduled, the narrative no longer belongs to the people who generated the original material. It belongs to the momentum. And momentum, once it starts moving, is not interested in official corrections. Leavitt's responses were competent. Her framing was controlled. But she was answering questions about a story whose tone had already been set by someone with better timing, a live studio audience, and 11 words about the village people, RFK Jr. and the raccoon. If the week needed any further evidence that something unusual was happening, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. provided it. Reports surfaced, drawn from his own personal diaries, published in book form, describing a series of incidents that ranged from eccentric to genuinely difficult to process on a first read. The one that traveled furthest involved a roadkill raccoon. The details do not need to be repeated in full. The fact that they exist, that they came from his own written record, and that he now holds a significant role in shaping national health policy created the kind of cognitive dissonance that Kimmel did not need to manufacture. He simply described what was already documented. Then, in the same segment, Kennedy came under additional scrutiny for publicly warning about the dangers of microplastics while being photographed using plastic products in an adjacent context. Again, Kimmel did not need to invent a contradiction. He just held 2 documented moments next to each other and let the audience notice what they noticed. Small details, in satire, hit harder than large ones because large controversies can be explained away with context and complexity. A small contradiction requires no explanation. It just sits there being exactly what it is. The war that was won 6 weeks ago. By week 7 of the conflict that had reportedly been resolved in week 1, the Strait of Hormuz situation had evolved into what Kimmel described as Hormuzapalooza. a word that should not have been as effective as it was, and yet somehow captured the specific flavor of an international crisis, being managed through a combination of genuine military engagement and enthusiastic social media messaging. The blockade of the blockade. The locked and loaded military. J.D. Vance preparing for the next round of negotiations after, as Kimmel noted carefully, the strong results of the previous round. Pete Hegseth's condition was described in a single word that Kimmel delivered with the deadpan precision of a surgeon making a very small and very accurate incision. The audience did not stop laughing for several seconds. The machine that won't slow down. Here is the thing about a week like this one, the kind where every single day generates new material faster than any one segment can process it. It does not belong to any single person involved in it. Not to Trump, who generated most of the raw material. Not to Leavitt, who had to defend it. Not to Kennedy, who contributed his portion. Not even to Kimmel, who was doing the processing. It belongs to the loop where a policy announcement becomes a punchline before the press conference ends, where an AI image becomes a meme before the post has been up for 3 hours, where a statement about the Pope's brother becomes a viral clip before anyone has had a chance to develop a coherent response to the original criticism of the Pope. In that loop, the question of who controls the narrative stops being a question about skill or strategy. It becomes a question about speed. And in the current media environment, the comedians have a structural advantage that press secretaries do not, because they are not trying to defend anything. They are just reacting, faster, with better timing, to material that keeps arriving already shaped like a punchline. That is the situation Karoline Leavitt was standing inside every day that week. And that is the situation that produced one of the stranger stretches of political coverage in recent memory, a stretch where a late-night host became the most efficient processor of the national mood, where an AI portrait of a quasi-divine president became a sincere piece of political communication, where the Pope's brother's MAGA credentials became a formal part of a papal dispute, and where a federal judge reminded everyone that national security is not, in fact, a blank check. Momentum, once it builds, rarely asks permission. And last week, it did not ask anyone's permission at all.